She was born into a world that never made things easy for her. From the very beginning, life tested her with struggles, but she grew up with a fire in her heart and a determination in her soul. She was not just an ordinary girl. She always dreamed bigger than the limits people tried to put around her. While others thought that being strong, brave, and a warrior was something meant only for men, she quietly carried a secret dream: to become a Navy SEAL. It was a dream that very few men could even achieve, and almost no woman had ever dared to attempt. But for her, this dream was not impossible. It was simply a mountain waiting to be climbed. As a child, she was fascinated by stories of soldiers, especially those who fought for freedom with courage and loyalty. She would often sit alone, watching the sky, imagining herself as a protector who could stand tall no matter how dangerous the mission. While other children played games, she trained her mind to stay focused. She ran faster, climbed higher, and pushed herself harder than anyone else around her. She knew deep inside that her life was meant for something greater. Growing up, she faced doubts from everyone. Teachers told her that girls should think about safe jobs. Neighbors whispered that she was too ambitious. Even her friends laughed when she said she wanted to wear the uniform of the most elite force in the world. But each time someone doubted her, she became stronger. She carried those words like weights on her shoulders, and instead of letting them break her, she used them to build her strength. When she was old enough, she joined the military. The journey was not easy. The training was brutal, designed to push even the toughest men to their limits. Days of exhaustion, nights of endless drills, and challenges that crushed the spirits of many recruits. But she kept going. She was smaller than many of the men and training beside her. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in heart. She could run longer, swim harder, and aim sharper because she refused to give up. Every morning, she woke up with the same thought: I have to prove them wrong. She wanted to show not only the world, but also herself that she had what it takes. Slowly, she began to rise above the rest. Her endurance surprised her trainers. Her shooting accuracy amazed even the toughest officers. And her ability to stay calm in the face of extreme pressure marked her as someone different, someone special. The Navy SEAL program was considered almost impossible to survive. Only the best of the best ever made it through. Many men dropped out during the infamous Hell Week, where sleep is almost non-existent and pain is constant. But she didn't drop out. She reminded herself of every insult, every doubt, every time someone told her she couldn't do it. She carried those memories like fuel in her veins, and they burned away her weakness. After months of punishment, training, and tests, she stood victorious. She had achieved what almost no one believed possible. She became one of the few women, and the only black woman at that time, to officially earn her place as a Navy SEAL sniper. It was more than just a title. It was proof that strength knows no gender, that courage has no limits, and that dreams can belong to anyone brave enough to chase them. Her role as a sniper was unlike anything ordinary. She trained her eye to focus on targets with precision so sharp that a single breath could decide success or failure. She learned patience, waiting in silence for hours, sometimes days, just for the right moment to act. She became the silent protector, the unseen guardian, the one who could make a difference from a hidden distance. Her reputation grew. Within the SEALs, she was respected not just for breaking barriers, but for excelling beyond expectations. She wasn't just the female sniper. She was one of the best snipers, period. Her fellow soldiers trusted her with their lives, and her commanders valued her unmatched skill. But with success also came challenges. Some people couldn't accept her place. Jealousy, prejudice, and hidden criticism followed her everywhere. Some whispered that she didn't belong, while others tried to discredit her achievements. Yet, she never fought back with words. She let her actions speak for her. Each mission completed, each life saved, and each target taken down became her answer to those who doubted her. Her journey was not only about military success, it was about showing the world that resilience and courage can break the strongest walls of doubt. She carried her story not just for herself, but for every young girl who had ever been told she was not enough. She carried it for her community, for her family, and for those who believed dreams should have no boundaries. By the time she walked into that courtroom one fateful day, she was already a legend in her own right. Behind her quiet eyes was a story of sacrifice, of endless battles fought both on the battlefield and within society. She had risen from being underestimated to becoming a symbol of unshakable strength. Her journey to that point was one of blood, sweat, tears, and victories that no chains could erase. And though thus, Courtroom was about to witness a shocking moment, the truth of her life's story would forever shine brighter than any doubt or injustice. The courtroom was not like any other place she had been before. She had stood on battlefields where bullets cut through the air, where every second was a fight for survival, and where courage was tested in the harshest ways possible. But this room felt different. Here, there were no rifles, no camouflage, and no mud under her boots. Instead, there were polished wooden benches, the heavy silence of authority, and the sharp eyes of strangers who had already formed opinions about her. She walked in with her head high, but every step echoed louder than it should have, as though the floor wanted to announce her presence to the world. People in the audience turned to look at her. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others shook their heads in disbelief, and a few whispered among themselves. They all knew who she was, the black female SEAL sniper whose name had once been celebrated in military circles. Yet today, she was not being celebrated. Today, she was being judged. The courtroom itself carried an atmosphere of control. The judge sat high above, like a figure carved out of stone, his face unreadable. Lawyers shuffled papers, pretending to be calm, but stealing glances at her as if they, too, could not believe this day had come. A few journalists scribbled notes, already crafting headlines that would turn her story into tomorrow's news. The clicking of their pens was the only sound breaking the silence, but it felt louder than gunfire. Despite the eyes on her, she stood tall. Years of training had taught her never to show weakness, never to let fear crawl across her face. Even now, with her honor hanging in the balance, she did not look down. She looked straight ahead, as if facing another mission, another battlefield. What made the scene even more unsettling was the way her military records seemed to hang over the room like an invisible banner. Everyone knew her story. They knew about the missions that had no names, the operations buried in silence, and the lives she had saved without ever being thanked publicly. Yet here she was, in a courtroom seat reserved for the accused, as though her service had been erased in an instant. Some in the crowd could not reconcile the two images, the silent, deadly precision of a sniper on a mission and the woman now standing in front of a judge. How could someone who had carried out her duty with such loyalty be standing in shackles? Whispers spread quickly through the benches. Some said she had been betrayed, others claimed she was dangerous. But no one really knew the truth, and that mystery kept the air heavy with tension. The courtroom walls seemed to close in around her. The flags behind the judge fluttered slightly in the cool air, symbols of justice and patriotism. Yet today they felt almost like a cruel reminder of the system that was now pressing down on her shoulders. For her, it was not just a trial of law, it was a trial of dignity. She could feel the weight of every stare. Some were filled with judgment, others with curiosity, and a few with silent respect. Among the crowd sat veterans who knew the meaning of sacrifice, their eyes reflecting quiet recognition. They did not need words to understand what it meant to be in her position. They knew that heroes often faced battles long after the battlefield was gone. When she was told to sit, she did so without hesitation. The wooden chair was uncomfortable, but she had endured worse. Her hands rested firmly on the table, her back straight, her eyes calm. She refused to let them see her spirit break. For her, this was not just about defending herself. It was about showing everyone that even in chains, she would not bow. The lawyers began to speak, but their voices blurred into background noise. She heard phrases like evidence, charges, and national security, but none of it felt real. What felt real were the moments flashing in her memory, her comrades on missions, the lives she had sworn to protect, and the weight of the sniper rifle she had carried with pride. Those memories were more powerful than any argument spoken in that courtroom. Every tick of the clock above the judge's bench felt like thunder. Time seemed slower here, dragging her into each second of discomfort. Yet, she did not move. She had been trained to wait for hours in the field, hidden, patient, waiting for the right moment. That same patience now became her shield. From the outside, the scene may have looked ordinary, a trial, a defendant, a judge. But for those in the room, it was extraordinary. It was not just a woman on trial. It was the image of service, sacrifice, and loyalty being placed under question. Everyone felt it. That was why the room stayed so quiet, so frozen, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then came the moment that none of them expected. The sound of the heavy door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned. The atmosphere shifted. Something was about to change, though no one could predict what. She did not flinch, but she felt it. The room's energy was no longer the same. Someone important had entered. Someone whose presence carried weight strong enough to silence even the sharpest whispers. This was no ordinary interruption. This was the arrival of an admiral. A man whose rank and authority could shift the entire balance of the courtroom in an instant. His entrance was not loud, but it was powerful. The air seemed heavier, and suddenly, every person in the room froze, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the courtroom had already been heavy, but what happened next struck like a lightning bolt no one was prepared for. As she sat there, calm and composed, the guards received a signal. Without hesitation, they moved toward her. At first, the audience thought they were simply adjusting positions, maybe ensuring the security of the courtroom. But within seconds, the truth became clear. The metallic clink of chains broke through the air as the guards pulled out handcuffs. The crowd gasped. Some leaned forward in disbelief. Others shook their heads in shock. The idea of shackling a woman who had once been trusted with the nation's most dangerous missions felt unreal, almost insulting. Yet, the guards carried out the order without hesitation. She did not resist. She had endured pain, hardship, and betrayal before. Resistance was never her way. Calmly, almost too calmly, she extended her wrists. The steel cuffs snapped shut around them with a cold finality. The sound was small, just a click, but in that silent room it echoed like a hammer against stone. For a moment, everyone froze. Even the judge paused, his gavel unmoving. Journalists quickly scribbled notes, their pens racing to capture the moment that would surely become tomorrow's headline. Decorated SEAL sniper shackled in court. Cameras clicked as photographers leaned forward, desperate to capture her humiliation. But humiliation was not what they found. Her face did not break. Her eyes did not flinch. Instead, she sat taller, her hands now chained, but her spirit unbent. In that moment, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a soldier accepting yet another mission. The audience, however, could not contain themselves. Murmurs swept through the benches. A woman whispered to her neighbor, "How could they do this to her?" Another man shook his head, muttering, "She fought for this country." Yet, and their whispers meant nothing in the face of the law being carried out. The guards tightened their grip as if expecting her to lash out. But she remained still. Inside, her heart was steady, just like it had been on missions where one mistake could cost lives. Shackles were nothing compared to the dangers she had already faced. She had been trained to lie still in freezing mud for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. She had survived storms at sea, endless nights of pain, and battles that would break ordinary people. Steel chains were nothing new. Still, the symbolism of it struck deep. For years, she had carried a weapon with precision and pride, trusted by the nation to protect its secrets and its people. And now, that same nation bound her in chains as though she were a threat to its safety. The contradiction burned in the eyes of every veteran sitting in that courtroom. They understood what this meant. Shackling her was not about safety. It was about control, about power, about showing the world that no one, not even a hero, was untouchable. One of the guards hesitated for a second. Perhaps he, too, had heard her story. Perhaps he had read about her missions, her sacrifices, her bravery. His eyes flickered with doubt, but duty outweighed emotion, and he finished locking the chain with a final tug. She felt the cold bite of steel on her wrists, but her expression never changed. Her training had taught her that emotions could be a weapon used against her. If she showed fear, they would win. If she showed anger, they would twist it. But if she showed nothing, only calmness, they would have no power. The judge finally cleared his throat and tried to continue, but the damage had been done. The audience no longer saw the trial in the same way. They were no longer looking at a case. They were looking at a human story, one of sacrifice and betrayal. To many, it felt like a performance, a display meant to humiliate her in public, to strip away the honor she carried. But ironically, the act had the opposite effect. Instead of looking weak, she looked stronger than ever. Shackled, yes, but not broken. The whispers grew louder, the tension unbearable. Some people even stood, unable to sit still. One journalist, forgetting her professionalism, muttered aloud, "This is history." And indeed, it was. Her thoughts, however, were not on the crowd. Inside her mind, she drifted back to her training days. She remembered the weight of the sniper rifle pressed against her shoulder, the long hours of crawling through dirt, the sound of her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of her breathing. Shackles or not, she was still that soldier. Chains could never erase that. And yet, as strong as she remained, the image of her in cuffs would spread like wildfire. Outside the walls of the courtroom, the public would soon see the photos, the headlines, the opinions. Some would call her guilty before the trial even ended. Others would rally behind her, demanding justice. But all of them would remember the sight of a warrior shackled in silence. The guards stood beside her now, one on each side, as though she were a dangerous criminal. To anyone who knew her history, the idea was almost laughable. She had been trained to defend life, not destroy it, and yet here she was, treated as if she were a threat to everyone around her. For the first time, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a battlefield. Only this time, her weapon was not in her hands. Her weapon was her dying Nitty, her silence, her unshakable spirit. Everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something they would never forget. The sight of her shackled was not just about her. It was about every soldier who had given everything only to find themselves forgotten, questioned, or betrayed by the very system they served. And in that silence, just as the room began to steady itself again, the back door creaked open. Footsteps echoed. A shadow fell across the aisle. The Admiral had entered, and in that single moment, every heart skipped a beat. The shackles had already shocked the room, but what came next would freeze it completely. The air inside the courtroom was already thick with tension, but when the sound of chains echoed, it was as if a silent explosion had gone off. For a split second, no one moved, no one breathed. The sight of her, an elite Navy SEAL sniper, a woman who had fought in places most people could not even imagine, now bound in shackles, sent shockwaves rippling through every corner of the room. The first reaction came from the audience. A gasp escaped from somewhere in the back. It was soft, almost whispered, but it set off a chain reaction. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and whispers began to spread like wildfire. "Did they really just shackle her?" someone muttered under their breath. Another voice followed, more firm this time. "She doesn't deserve this." The courtroom was supposed to be a place of silence and order, but now it buzzed with disbelief. Journalists in the front rows leaned forward eagerly, their pens scratching across notepads, their cameras flashing like lightning. They lived for moments like this, scenes that could fill headlines, sell papers, and dominate broadcasts. One reporter whispered to another, "This story just got bigger." And indeed it had. But it wasn't only the journalists or spectators who were shaken. Even the judge, a man known for his rigid discipline and calm authority, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face remained stern, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his unease. He cleared his throat as though trying to steady the atmosphere, but the weight of the scene pressed down harder than his gavel ever could. The guards, too, seemed unsettled. They had followed orders, yes, but the moment the cuffs clicked shut, they became part of a picture they had not signed up for. One of them avoided eye contact with the crowd, ashamed, while the other stood stiffly, pretending not to hear the whispers of disapproval. Both men felt the judgment of the room heavy on their shoulders. And then, the veterans in the gallery began to react. They were easy to spot, their posture straight, their faces weathered, their eyes filled with memories that civilians could never understand. To them, she was more than just a woman in uniform. She was a symbol. She was proof that barriers could be broken, that loyalty had no gender or color. Watching her chained like a criminal felt like a betrayal of every oath they had once taken. One of the older veterans clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Another shook his head slowly, whispering, "This isn't right." The tension grew heavier with every passing second. The air seemed to vibrate with the unspoken conflict. On one side, the authority of the law. On the other, the weight of honor and respect she had earned. She sat silently through it all, her back straight, her chin lifted. If the room was breaking apart, she was not. Her calmness made the scene even more powerful. The chains around her wrists gleamed under the courtroom lights, but her eyes told a different story. They were steady, unbroken, the same eyes that had once looked through a sniper scope with deadly precision. She was not begging for pity, and she was not looking for rescue. She was simply present, embodying the quiet strength that had carried her through every battle of her life. But the people could not let it rest. The whispers grew louder, blending into a chorus of disbelief. How could they do this? She saved lives. Is this justice? The courtroom, usually a place where voices were kept low and respectful, now brimmed with tension so thick it threatened to spill over. Even the journalists, who were supposed to stay detached, found themselves divided. Some looked at her with cold, calculating eyes, seeing only the story. Others stared with something closer to awe, realizing that they were witnessing history in the making. For her, it felt like standing in the middle of a storm. She had been in storms before. The violent chaos of war zones, the deafening thunder of explosions. But this storm was different. This was a storm of judgment, of eyes piercing into her, of whispers cutting sharper than bullets. And yet, she did what she had always done. She endured. The judge finally lifted his gavel and struck it against the block, the sharp crack demanding silence. The sound echoed through the chamber, temporarily silencing the crowd. But silence did not erase what had happened. The image of her in chains was already burned into everyone's mind. For the people sitting there, the scene was unforgettable. Some would go home that night and tell their families about the moment they saw a Navy SEAL sniper in shackles. Others would write about it, argue about it, or try to make sense of it, but no one would forget it. The shock waves of that moment had traveled too far, too deep, to ever be erased. And then, just when it seemed the courtroom might steady itself, the door at the back opened with a deep creak. A man in uniform entered. His steps were heavy, his presence commanding. The ribbons and stars on his chest caught the light. He was not just anyone. He was an admiral. The shock waves that had rippled through the room before now turned into silence. Sea so deep, it was suffocating. Every head turned. Every whisper died. If the shackling had shaken the courtroom, the admiral's entrance froze it completely. The moment the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom opened, the entire atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the creak of the hinges or the thud of polished shoes striking the floor. It was the presence that swept in, commanding attention without a single word. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pens stopped moving. Even the judge, perched high above with his gavel, paused in his motions. An admiral had entered. His uniform spoke before he did. The crisp, white jacket gleamed under the courtroom lights, decorated with rows of medals and ribbons that told stories of decades of service. His cap was tucked neatly under his arm, his posture straight as a blade. Every step he took echoed authority, the kind of authority that wasn't demanded but earned, on ships, on seas, and on battlefields far away. The room responded instinctively. People who moments ago had been whispering leaned back into silence. Veterans in the gallery straightened in their seats, almost saluting out of reflex. Even the guards holding her in shackles shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do under the weight of his gaze. She noticed him too. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, there was an unspoken recognition. He wasn't looking at her as a defendant. He wasn't looking at her as a woman in chains. He was looking at her as a soldier, as one of his own. That acknowledgement, silent and powerful, was enough to cut through the humiliation of the shackles around her wrists. The Admiral walked slowly, deliberately, as though he knew every step was being watched. And indeed, every pair of eyes in the courtroom followed him. He carried not just himself, but the weight of his rank, his experience, and his reputation. To many in that room, his entrance felt like a storm had rolled in. Quiet, steady, but impossible to ignore. When he reached the center aisle, he stopped. The silence was unbearable now, like the air before a thunderclap. People waited for him to speak, but he didn't. He simply turned his head toward the judge, his face calm but firm. It was the kind of look that spoke louder than words, a look that said, "I am here, and I am watching." The judge cleared his throat, visibly unsettled. For a man used to having absolute control of his courtroom, the Admiral's presence felt like a challenge, though no words of challenge had been spoken. Authority recognized authority, and the balance of power had quietly shifted. The guards tightened their hold on her arms, almost nervously, but the Admiral's eyes flicked toward them, and that was enough. They froze, their grip loosening slightly as if his silent authority overpowered the orders they had been given. They didn't dare move further. The audience could feel it too. Whispers began again, not in shock this time, but in awe. "That's Admiral," someone started, their voice trailing off as though saying his name aloud would break the spell. Others leaned forward, eager to see what he would do. Was he here as a witness, as an observer, or as something far more significant? She, still shackled, sat taller in her chair. The Admiral's presence was like a shield, invisible but real. For the first time that day, she didn't feel alone. She had been trained to endure pain, to endure humiliation, but now endurance shifted into something else, strength reinforced by recognition. She was not just a prisoner in chains, she was a warrior acknowledged by one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy. Finally, the Admiral moved closer, his shoes striking the marble floor with steady rhythm. He stopped near her table, his eyes scanning her, the guards, and then the judge again. Still, he said nothing. And yet, the silence he carried was louder than any statement could have been. The judge tried to regain control. He tapped his gavel, though softer this time, almost respectfully. "This court will remain in order," he said, but the strength behind his words was weaker now. Everyone could sense it. The Admiral's presence had changed the room. For the journalists, the story had shifted yet again. They no longer saw just a shackled SEAL sniper. They saw a courtroom scene transformed by the entrance of a living legend. Their pens scratched furiously, trying to capture every detail, every gesture, every second of the Admiral's unspoken authority. And for the veterans, the moment was electric. They saw in the Admiral's entrance a validation of everything they had felt, the injustice of shackling one of their own. His silence was their voice, a voice too powerful to be ignored. The Admiral finally took a seat, not in the back, not in the shadows, but close enough that his presence could not be dismissed. He folded his hands neatly, his eyes locked on the proceedings. He did not need to speak. His very being said it all. "I am here, and I will not look away." The shock of the shackles had unsettled the courtroom, but the Admiral's entrance froze it entirely. What had once been whispers of disbelief now became silence of reverence. No one moved carelessly, no one dared speak loudly. Even the air felt heavy, waiting for what would come next. And she, sitting there in chains, knew one thing for certain. The battle was not hers alone anymore. With the Admiral in the room, the tide had shifted. The Admiral sat down without a word, but his silence carried more power than speeches ever could. He didn't need to raise his voice or pound on the table. The simple act of being there, in full uniform, his ribbons gleaming under the lights, was enough to command respect from every single person in that courtroom. The air shifted. People who had been restless and whispering moments ago now sat frozen, as though an invisible hand had pressed down on the room. Even the judge, a man accustomed to holding absolute authority in his courtroom, glanced at the Admiral more often than he should have. His gavel rested in his hand, but for once, it seemed more like a decoration than a tool of command. The guards flanking her still stood stiffly at her side, but their movements betrayed unease. Their hands twitched nervously against her arms, as though they were unsure whether to tighten their grip or let go entirely. The Admiral had not spoken to them, had not even looked directly into their eyes, but they felt his authority pressing down harder than any order they had ever received. She noticed it too. Shackled as she was, she could sense the shift in control. The humiliation of being bound with cold steel had been heavy, but the Admiral's presence turned that weight into something different. It was as though he had wrapped an invisible cloak of dignity around her, shielding her from the eyes that sought to shame her. Her back, already straight, grew even taller. Her eyes, already steady, sharpened with new resolve. The journalists were stunned. Their pens hovered in the air, paused between notes. Some scribbled furiously, trying to capture the electricity of the moment. An admiral enters the courtroom. The room freezes. Others simply watched, realizing that this was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a moment in history, a moment where silence itself had become the loudest statement of all. The veterans in the gallery felt it strongest. They had lived under the shadow of admirals before, had felt the weight of their presence on ships and battlefields. They knew what it meant to sit in front of a man whose very posture carried the weight of decades of service. For them, the Admiral was more than a high-ranking officer. He was a living embodiment of military honor. And seeing him here, silent but firm, felt like justice itself had stepped into the room. Every second stretched longer than it should have. The clock ticked softly above the judge's bench, but the sound seemed distant compared to the heavy silence filling the air. No one dared cough, no one dared shuffle their feet. The Admiral's authority was not spoken, but it was felt. It was in the straightness of his spine, the stillness of his hands, the unyielding calm of his gaze. The judge finally attempted to resume. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, wavered slightly as he addressed the court. "Let us continue with the proceedings," he said, his tone formal but weaker than before. He glanced at the Admiral once more, as though seeking silent permission to go on. The Admiral gave no reaction. He simply sat, eyes forward, expression unreadable. And yet, that was enough. The judge quickly turned back to his papers, unwilling to test the quiet authority that sat in front of him. The guards, too, softened their stance. Their grips on her arms loosened. Their movements became less rigid. They looked like men caught between two worlds, one where they were told to treat her like a criminal, and another where the presence of an admiral reminded them that she was a soldier, a decorated one at that. For her, it was a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, the weight of the shackles still pressed into her skin, cold and unyielding. On the other, the Admiral's presence felt like a shield, invisible but impenetrable. She had faced missions where silence was her greatest weapon, waiting in the shadows, unseen, unheard, until the perfect moment arrived. Now, she realized, the Admiral was doing the same. His silence was not emptiness. It was strategy. It was control. The audience understood too. Silence in that room had become louder than protest. It was louder than gasps, louder than whispers, louder than any words the lawyers could have spoken. The Admiral's authority did not need sound. It lived in the hearts of everyone present, in the way their bodies froze, in the way their voices died before reaching their lips. Even the journalists stopped scribbling for a moment, looking up as though waiting for something monumental to happen. They realized that what they were witnessing was not ordinary. It was rare, almost sacred, the kind of moment where power revealed itself not through volume, but through restraint. And then, something subtle but powerful happened. One of the guards, without being told, adjusted her chains. He loosened them slightly, making them less tight around her wrists. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticeable to the rest of the room, but she felt it. She looked at him briefly, and in his eyes she saw it. The Admiral's silent authority had reached him too. He had not been ordered. He had simply acted, compelled by the weight of the moment. The Admiral never moved. He never spoke. Yet his silence spread like a tide, reshaping the entire courtroom. Where moments ago she had been humiliated, now she sat as though crowned with invisible armor. Where moments ago the guards had seen her as a prisoner, now they saw her as a soldier. The silence grew, heavier still, until it was almost unbearable. And just when it seemed the room could not possibly hold its breath any longer, the Admiral finally shifted in his seat. The movement was small, a simple leaning forward, his hands clasping together. But the impact was massive. Every head turned, every heart skipped. The question hung in the air. Would he finally speak? The answer didn't matter. His silence had already spoken volumes.